Hi, Freddie. Welcome to the Never Fully Heard podcast. Thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, good to see you. Where I want to start is, do you mind just giving a quick, professional background of yourself to help give some context to the conversation?
Yes, absolutely. I'm an integrative counsellor, and I specialise in working with addictions, eating disorders, and other compulsive conditions, and emotional well-being in general. And I did my master's in addiction psychology and counselling back in 2005, and it's taken me on a journey through the addiction world, but on into other facets of mental health and well-being alongside it.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Where I want to then start is, what's your when did you first understand what mental health even was?
It wasn't until I encountered my own issues. I came from a fairly traditional background, and within my family of origin, there was a lot of love and there was a lot of great stuff happening. There wasn't a great deal of emotional communication going on, and as a result of that, it just hadn't even occurred to me that I could talk to anyone else about how I felt. It was a complete revelation when I discovered that was actually a possibility, and how much of a difference it makes to open up and to, there's that old saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. And I'd say that it doesn't take that much for someone to be able to shift how they feel, depending on the complexity and how long someone's been working with a particular condition, that's going to influence it. But just being able to bring what we're experiencing and know that it's okay to articulate it to another human being can make the world of difference. So I came to an understanding of mental health and emotional well-being through my own crisis, which happened when I was around, sort of between the age of 19 and 22.
And was it was it therapy that helped you get through that crisis?
I don't think I would have been open to therapy if it hadn't been for the fact that every single other avenue was exhausted. So I had a health condition. I had chronic fatigue and irritable bowel syndrome, and it was pretty extreme. I had to quit university. I was kind of holed up for a couple of years, living with my parents, wondering what on earth had happened, as I had no energy to do anything, and I was experiencing a lot of physical discomfort. And we interpreted what was happening to me through the lens of physical health. It hadn't occurred to any of us that there might be some emotional and mental components to what was going on. But what emerged over time was that I had my relationship with food was very unhealthy, and I'd been using that unconsciously to manage how I felt. And the consequences of that, and generally repressing my emotional self, were that my energy levels had just fallen out of the bottom. There was just nothing there. And although that was an extremely painful and difficult time and very isolating, it was also an extraordinary gift, because it required me to start to explore the internal terrain of who I am and what was happening inside me. And I don't think if that hadn't have happened, I probably would never have felt the motivation to connect with myself. I think I probably would have continued with business as usual, doing what I thought was expected of me, and living the life that my culture and my upbringing had decreed as normal. And I think I would have missed out on a lot of very beautiful things that, as a result of having to encounter all this stuff in myself, I've been able to connect with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it's a very personal story. And how did that lead you to a career in mental health and it being a full-time occupation?
Well, I think it's probably quite a common pathway for a lot of people is somehow their own lives being touched or affected by their own or someone close to them suffering, and that catalysing an interest in, okay, how can I support other people with this? And for me, the thing that really helped me in the end was ending up going into a 12-step rehabilitation centre. And whilst I was there, I got the kind of level of support from members of staff, but also from other recovering, it was addicts, people with eating disorders, people with drug and alcohol addiction, and any other type of process addiction you can think of, all together. And that kind of cauldron enabled me to really kind of find the courage to look at myself and talk about how I felt, and realise that I wasn't the only one, and that there were lots of other people in the same sort of boat. And during the course of that, I suppose I sort of realised that it was the skill of those people around me that really supported me to feel able, to kind of start to peel off the layers of the onion and make it feel safe enough to do it. And although I didn't become a therapist straight away, which some people do because they're just so into it, I was pretty young. I was only 22 when I came through that, and I realised for the first time in my life that my life was completely and utterly my own, and that I could do anything that I wanted to do with it. And my great passion was music, and so I went off and worked in the music industry for 3 or 4 years, and had an amazing time. But when I came to the end of that period, what I realised is that I was actually way more interested in what everyone in the room was feeling than in capturing the perfect sound in the recording studio or whatever else I was supposed to be focusing on. And that was the moment at which I thought, well, I might as well use that to my advantage and hopefully help other people at the same time. So
yeah, it's great to hear. It's great to hear that story. And for the, I guess most people would have heard the word therapy, but for those that I guess haven't had it or don't have a good understanding, or how would you describe therapy in a kind of a broad sense?
There are different types, lots of very different types of therapy, different schools of therapy. So depending upon who you choose to go and see, there'll be a different orientation and expectation, and there'll be different modalities which they're helping you with. But in its most basic form, most different therapeutic modalities, whether it's simple short-term counselling, all the way through to really long-term, deeply relational psychotherapy, the understanding is that you're being supported by someone who is coming alongside you, who will listen to you non-judgmentally, who has a professional understanding of what it is that you're encountering. So rather than simply listening, hopefully they'll also have an understanding of the territory that you're bringing to them and be able to make helpful suggestions where appropriate. But they'll also know that their job is not to fix you or to kind of magically try and make everything better, because that can have the problem of making you feel like you shouldn't be talking about what you're struggling with, or that you should be able to solve it. So that person hopefully can really give you a sense of like, whatever I say to this person, it's going to be okay, and I can really bring my greatest fears and my sort of worst thoughts that I have about myself or other people, and for that to be okay. And when, in my experience, when I do that, and often other people, it seems to be the case for as well, it takes a lot of the power out of what I'm really afraid of. It sort of loses its hold, and then I can start to look at it rationally, and I can also start to look at what's underneath it. What is that obsessive thought that keeps coming back, or that kind of dream that I keep having? What is that speaking to in the deeper history of my life and what I've experienced? And it doesn't have to be this terrifying thing that I just have to repress and ignore and push out of my awareness. It can actually lead me to understand myself so much better. So it could be short term. It could be six sessions, and then at that point you finished, you're done. If you do that, it's probably going to be an issue, a behavioural issue that you want help with specifically. Or you could do 6 sessions and then review and see what's happening. Midterm therapy is anything usually from 12 sessions to 3 months, and then more than 6 months would be considered to be long-term therapy. And some people, they just find it so helpful that they want to continue it even after the initial problem has happened, and that's great. And I think it's everyone has their own path with it. But it's also, ideally, the purpose of therapy is to support someone to be able to then come into a place in their life where they're able to move forwards without the need for professional help ongoingly, and to incorporate the lessons that they've learned into how they hold themselves in their lives.
Yeah, thank you. That was incredibly explained. From your experience, what are some of the themes that come up with men and their mental health?
It's I find regularly it's a very different territory that I'm working with men as opposed to women, and of course there are huge overlaps, and the whole sort of gender identification question, is one that I'm very conscious of. But I think that there are orientations that men and women have towards that attune themselves towards quite naturally and automatically, and I find it helpful to acknowledge them. So a big tendency, I would say, for men is to repress our emotional selves, to conform to the ideal of efficacy over and action over being and feeling, thinking and thinking is very much approved of, whereas feeling isn't so much. And I think that has quite a big impact on how we respond to the different emotions. So sadness, in my experience, and fear are both fairly unwelcome within the masculine psyche. So we tend to repress those. We tend to not admit to them, to ourselves or to others. Whereas if we are going to feel something that's not sort of just okay or good, then that tends to be anger. So a lot more people that I work with, a lot more men that I work with, would identify as at times feeling angry, or anger being more accessible to them than sadness or fear, for example.
That's so interesting, that word accessible. Do you think that's because it's almost like a habit that people have learnt that they've more regularly accessed that, so therefore it becomes easier and easier to? Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're socialized into different roles. And although those roles very happily are breaking down and becoming a lot more fluid and questionable than they were, they're nonetheless, I mean, you know, many generations worth of legacy behind them. And so we've got a long way to go still. But, you know, just phrases like "boys don't cry" carry a lot of weight, and they carry a lot more weight when they've been sort of followed up with action. You know, rejection, teasing, humiliation, etc. in the playground, or perhaps with a member of our families. You know, that leaves a really strong impression. And you know, something as a therapist that I'm very aware of is that the messages that we receive when we're young, in those formative developmental years, you know, they literally get baked into our neuropsychology. So our brain's architecture is wired around what we experience and what we see around us when we're in that very early stages. So even though intellectually we can recognize, oh, there's nothing wrong with feeling sad, there's nothing wrong with, you know, expressing fear, that's not what we're experiencing in our physical bodies. And it takes the willingness to meet those conditions within that conditioning within ourselves, and to meet the fear that will bring up, because we're breaking contracts, behavioral contracts, essentially, that we agreed to without realizing it when we were very young. And that brings up a lot of fear, because you know we're very intelligent, and our systems know how to adapt to the environment in which they grow up in, and they're very good at it. The problem is that then creates a lot of problems further down the line, and we have to unlearn all of that unhealthy conditioning from earlier on.
That the phrase you put was emotional contracts that we agreed to without knowing. That really just rung true for some of the therapy that I've done. That I had almost it's almost like I'd agreed to play this role as a character without knowing it as a child, to help whether it's like please, or to get some sort of affirmation in a certain moment in time, and then that's played its way out across my whole life. But that's you put words to something that I haven't before. So I thought that was really interesting. What does the feeling of like emotional repression, how, I guess, what is that, and how does it manifest itself in people's lives and their bodies?
There's a wonderful phrase, living lives of quiet desperation, which I think can sum up a lot of what depression is all about. In my experience, very often depression isn't some kind of random chemical imbalance, although of course it involves a chemical imbalance within our brains. But it has roots, you know, in other things. And if we've been taught that, or we've somehow taken on the belief that it's not okay to feel what we feel, it's maybe not okay to, you know, get angry, or it's not okay to get sad, or it's not okay even to be rambunctious and happy as a child. Maybe there wasn't enough space, you know, within our household for that to be okay. Then we learn to adapt, as we've said, and that has an impact on our energy system, on our, you know, emotional system. And that emotion, I often compare our emotional lives to the weather. You know, there's no good or bad about it. It's simply experiences that are passing through our bodies and our minds, and that have huge amounts of benefit to them, all of them. Just as the rain nourishes, you know, the plants that need to grow, our tears and our sadness are essential for us to be able to feel love and connection. You know, if we didn't value the connections that we have, we wouldn't feel loss over losing them. So they're two sides. You know, grief and love are two sides of the same coin. And so if we repress that part of ourselves where we can't let ourselves feel our grief, for example, then that creates a deadening across the whole of our emotional systems, and it builds up. And at first, of course, you don't realize it. You don't know it. This is the system you've grown up in. This is the norm. And it's only over time when you know, your energy begins to go down, or you find yourself constantly reaching for something that's tipped over from being a helpful strategy for managing stress to something that's actually numbing you out and having increasing negative consequences in your life, for example. And that's when we realize that there's a bit of a problem, but we don't really know how to solve it, because it wasn't something that we consciously created. It just came about.
And I guess what interested you enough about addiction to want to specialize or lean into that as a part of your kind of a professional development?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's the kind of recovery pathway that I went through for my eating disorder issues, kind of categorized what I was going through as an addictive process. And there are some question marks around that, and there are lots of different ways of looking at it. But for me, that was at the time a very helpful way to look at things. And I recognized that if I hadn't have developed my coping strategies around food, which really numbed me out and helped me to repress all of that emotional pain that I wasn't even aware was there, then I probably would have gone down the drugs route. I just loved anything that would help me feel great, and numb me out, rather than being connected with what was actually going on inside me. So I kind of considered myself to be a recovering addict, in lots of different ways, and my understanding now is that any addiction or any compulsive, self-destructive strategy is it's part of, it's simply a symptom and an expression of a deeper underlying malaise. And so although my training was specifically around addiction and addiction psychology, of course that involves looking at all of the deeper issues that create that response. And so trauma and attachment issues where we don't feel safe in those primary relationships growing up, I will see as part of the causal factors for addiction.
Are there any skews one way or the other on gender with addiction, or is it fairly equal in terms of how the different genders experience addiction?
That's a good question. There's certainly a lot more women who experience issues around food specifically and body image than there are men, although that has been changing a lot. It's very different, the composure of eating disorder services now to what it was when I came around 20 years ago or so. But nonetheless, those pressures are more keenly felt, within the female population. And types of drug use, there tends to be a higher prevalence of male use for cocaine and some of the more sort of hedonistic drugs. But I would say that they can express themselves in both genders very, very much. That there is I kind of wanted to touch on this earlier, and so there's a good opportunity to bring it back in. Something that I find really helpful is to recognize that I don't believe that the different types of the different orientations of the masculine and the feminine psyche, I don't believe that they're entirely cultural constructs. That's a huge part of it. We're conditioned into looking at the world in these ways. But there are also these archetypal orientations that seem to run through cultures, across history and geography. And Jung, great protege of Freud, was really interested in these, and he did a lot of exploration around it. And anyway, so he, there are certain orientations that it would seem the masculine and the feminine psyche are drawn to and are strong within. And that doesn't mean that a man is strong within the masculine necessarily and a woman is strong within the feminine. Both men and women have full access to the masculine and the feminine aspects of themselves. But often there is a primary orientation, towards the masculine within a male figure, and the same the other way within the feminine. So I find that very helpful to hold, because otherwise I think it can create quite a lot of shame particularly within the masculine psyche. We're living in the thankfully post-feminist period, and recognizing the impact of the dominant paradigm of a male run and dominated society, and the trauma and the legacy that that's created is vast. It's going to take us a long time to deconstruct all of that and to heal all of that. But I think that presents a particular problem for men today, because how do we hold that, the awareness of the impact that's had, and how do we not feel huge levels of shame about that, how do we not feel very concerned about and fearful of that perhaps more wild masculine aspect that is orientated towards action and instinct and sexuality, for example. It's something that we have to come into a relationship with. And I came from a place of, I think, being very conscious of the impact of our history on women, and really sort of feeling a lot of shame as a result of that. But what I've come to realize is that that's not a helpful response. It's good to recognize it, and it's good to be emotionally attuned to the impact of it. But actually, in order for healing to happen, I need to be able to honor myself, the whole of myself as I am, and step into the positive aspects of the masculine psyche rather than the toxic ones, which is what history has been sort of littered with examples of. But there is this upstanding, noble aspect of masculinity that I think has got quite lost within, understandably, within this redressing of the imbalance that there has been. And there's some really fantastic men's organizations out there that support, I think, those of us who struggle with this stuff to come into a more balanced place around it and reclaim, a sense of healthy pride about being a man, and the positive impact that can have on our own children, on our sons, and on our daughters, and on our partners, and on our mothers, and everything else.
100%. That's 100%. What is it about, I guess, masculinity that men really struggle to come to terms with? Because it feels as if, from I guess listening to a lot of podcasts and doing some reading, it feels like there's a lot of men that feel lost, that they can't fully connect with their masculinity, or can't connect with some of their emotions, or feel ashamed of having like anger, or having like not understanding why there's a certain like darkness or aggression that is a part of themselves. And I guess how have you seen that play out?
Yeah. I think it plays out in society all the time, in gang culture, and or the opposite extreme of just numbing and dissociation and suicidal impulse. And I think that there's a sort of wider context to be acknowledged as well. Post-industrialization and the breakdown of the nuclear family, and the absence of sort of healthy and embodied role models, male role models, I think has had a big impact on society, because we go away now to work, whereas within we are living in an absolutely radically altered societal structure to what humanity has been experiencing for 200,000 years, or however long it's taken us to get to this point. I mean, literally in the flash of an eye, in a few generations, essentially, we've gone from foraging and living in tribal networks where we're deeply connected to one another and reliant on one another and exposed to one another, into a hugely atomized society where sons will not see their fathers for the majority of their childhoods. Some hours at the weekend, if we're lucky, and that has an impact. On another level, I think as a society in general, we're struggling to catch up with the pace of the technological advances that are going on as well. We've come so far in so short a time, and we're like kids playing with these things without knowing what they're doing to us. And so I think a lot of us are in a state of hyperarousal. We're just kind of surviving, the best we can, and so we're particularly prone, I think, at this period within humanity's history to reaching out for things which feel good and certainly are convenient and pleasurable in the moment, but which aren't conducive to our well-being longer term, or to our relationships, or to our sense of purpose and connection to something greater. So for me, coming back into the body is really helpful with this. Coming back into an environment that helps remind me that I'm actually an animal, and I have a body that has needs. I can't exist solely through a screen, and it's hugely helpful. And so I've become much more interested over time in nature-based therapy and contexts that support us to come back into connection with this entire ecosystem that we're entirely dependent upon, but have become so alienated from, to the extent that we can actually be in a process of destroying it and not recognize what we're doing to ourselves and to the rest of the world. So, yeah.
That phrase hyperarousal, I think, is it's just so true in today's society. I mean, phone addiction is, we see it as it's almost like it's a jovial topic for many, that people are spending 4 or 5 hours a day on their phones. But if you add that up across a week, like months, years, it's so much of your life is sucked into this phone, and you're comparing yourself to the most attractive. That it's and porn addiction is another one, which is hyperarousal, which I think is I think we're going to see some really devastating impacts on young men in particular, but I think both. I think it's also affecting some of my female friends as well. But I guess it's less addressed at the moment. But I think I can name at least 3 or 4 people in my reasonably close network of friends who struggle with it, and it's not considered the same as some other addictions, because I think there's almost like a delayed impact of it, from what I understand. I don't know if you've seen much of that and what the impact is.
Yeah, I see a lot of it, and I think you're absolutely right that it's way more prevalent than we realise. Because there's so much shame often attached to that. It's done in secret, and we feel like there's something wrong with us because of it. But in fact, all that's happening is that we're a little bit like the obesity epidemic. We've suddenly got access to all of these things which only a few generations ago were completely inaccessible. And how can we possibly know how to regulate our relationship to this stuff? It's so new, but yes, it's very, very powerful, porn addiction, because it's acting on all the same parts of the same sort of neurocircuits within the brain that other addictive processes and substances are working on. But you don't need to introduce. You don't have the problem of having to go out and score. It's just so instantly accessible, and I think it's having a huge impact on people's capacity to actually experience pleasure in the act of physical connection, because we're now it's like our sexuality is developed through the context of objectification, in a way that it wasn't before. So there's a lot of healing to be done around this stuff, and it's really encouraging to see people starting to talk about it more and bring it out into the open. And it's a really, really serious problem. And I think part of the problem is it's a little bit like smoking. If we're going to compare it to a physical addiction, there's no immediate negative consequence. So what's the problem? It's only when you got cancer, 20 years down the line, that you're like, shit, I should have thought about that. I should have listened to it. And it's the same with porn addiction. It feels harmless. It feels normal. Everyone's doing it. Whatever. What's the big deal? And not to say that there isn't a place for exploring that part of ourselves, but we just have to be really careful about what we're opening up in ourselves, and try to be honest with ourselves about whether there's any unintended consequences from the amount of exposure that we're having to it. Are we staying on porn websites for longer than we intended to? Is it impacting our desire and our motivation to go out there and actually seek an embodied sexual experience or relationship or partnership that could kind of give us that as part of it? Are we finding ourselves requiring more extreme material to feel the same level of arousal that we used to feel from just watching something fairly vanilla? And those are some of the hallmarks of the preoccupation. Do we find ourselves looking forward to the moment when we can? Do we find ourselves lying to our partners about whether we're doing this or not? All of that stuff indicates that there might be some kind of dependence developing that needs looking at.
And once someone gets to the level, I guess, is there any sort of definition of what the actual addiction is? There a certain amount that someone is watching that they should at that point consider reaching out for help, or to look into getting help? Is there a certain level you'd say that is at that point?
Yeah. One of the problems with measuring addiction is defining addiction, and it's something that's regularly debated. But ultimately, it's when the negative consequences start to outweigh the positive impacts that we realise that there's a problem. And for a lot of people, we don't want to admit it to ourselves, because it's serving a purpose for us, And if there is repressed emotional stuff for somebody, which for most of us there is, that's part of the human experience. If that is sort of in play, then the part of our psyche that's come up with this strategy as a way for dealing with our discomfort is not going to want to relinquish it. And so this is where the whole concept of denial comes in, which is a big one within addiction, because our brain will literally discredit the negatives and focus only on the positives, even when all the evidence stacks up the other way. And so that's where often it's not until there start being external consequences, negative consequences, which we can't deny any longer, and that other people start to see, that we start to kind of be like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I really do need to do something here. But if we can find the courage to be honest with ourselves earlier on, and maybe confide in someone and talk to someone, okay, hey, but is it normal? Like, this is how much I'm kind of going online and looking at this stuff, and and also to choose wisely who we ask to do that with, because if we only if we only ask the person who we know already, has a similar kind of level of engagement to us, same as the alcoholic who will only compare himself to all of his mates who he meets at the pub every night. So yeah, we do need to be mindful of the ways in which we evade being honest with ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I guess porn addiction is a tough one, because I guess people can, unless I guess someone's partner may start to notice if they drop a desire for sex, or they aren't able to perform in the same way. But if you're, I guess, single, then you can avoid the conversation, because it's only the partners you may be engaging in casually that would ever notice a difference, or may not even notice a difference. So that's where I think it's going to be really tough to address. But I think the more conversations, the better. Yeah, the next I just wanted to ask before we kind of wrap up is, for people that haven't experienced what it's like to feel some of the addictive tendencies, or know how to recognize in other people, what are some of the ones for, say, in particular, alcohol or other addictive behaviors that you've seen that can help people understand it better?
Yeah, well, very often that there is a there's a kind of, there might be a trigger event that is particularly stressful or distressing for somebody, that that they respond to by stepping up their drinking, or intensifying their restriction if they've got issues around food, or it's, and it might be that you notice that your friend or your family member, rather than alcohol or drug use being incidental and just sort of on the side part of what they do, it's actually starting to determine their choices. And so they'll only want to meet up with you if it's within the context of being able to drink as well. And it's, there's that subtle shift, and that's the point at which, when the alarm bells start going off, or you notice them starting to be less responsive, less attuned to your or other people's emotional needs, isolating more, not responding, and quite often there might start to be some physical health impacts. That person will be a bit tired, getting ill a bit more often, playing truant a little bit more, missing stuff. There might be financial consequences start to stack up, spending too much on this thing. Legal consequences, of course, is a big one, and health consequences too, So yeah, it's just about looking at, and there might also be more emotional dysregulation. So, flatness, depression, more kind of explosive emotions, that sort of thing. Those are what to look at.
To finish, is there anything that you want that you're passionate about, or that you think would be an interesting point to finish the podcast on? I'm happy for you to talk about anything that you want to, really.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I've become really interested in eco-psychology, as it's described as sort of emerging field of taking people out into natural environments and settings to do therapeutic work. And there's all sorts of historical context for that. Dickens, he was notoriously a massive walker. He would take himself out and walk for miles on end to get rid of his depression and to feel better. Through to indigenous cultures, which have vision quest experiences where they go out and expose themselves intentionally to the elements, and might have a practice of not eating and not sleeping for 4 days and nights in a row in a wild place, and just seeing what comes. And all of that, it's good to do with support and within a context that can help you to process it, because it's how we process it and digest those experiences is every bit as important as doing something dramatic and initiatory like that. But yeah, so I've been working more and more in that sort of arena, and I work down in Devon, near Dartmoor, and I have a retreat centre which I've been setting up for the last 5 years or so, and people can come and they can have sort of their own individual experiences and retreats, and there are also wider trainings and retreats that go on there. It's called the Hearth. Hearthdevon.com is the website if you're interested. And there's also a charity that I work with called Right to Freedom, RITE, Right to Freedom. And we take recovering addicts up onto Dartmoor for rites of passage experiences and focusing on mindfulness, creativity, and nature connection. And that's beautiful and powerful work. And Yes, I think, there's a strong movement within existing services towards green spaces and incorporating the unbelievably powerful healing, capacity of nature into our mental health services as well. It's a sort of no-brainer. It's a win-win situation for everybody. It doesn't cost very much. Exactly. Everyone feels better. And as a therapist, it's really interesting to work in that space because whereas if I'm sitting in a room with someone, primarily I and that person are the interacting stimulus, and how I respond will support that person, and the thoughts that come in and the feelings that I'm experiencing, I'll integrate into the session, and hopefully it will be useful information that will open things up. But move into a natural space, and there's a whole host of stimulus and ephemera that can trigger off things for people, and can open up avenues of exploration that are fascinating and liberating and embodying and all those things. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to explore that as a way. And if someone's got just a quite simple sort of aversion to the idea of going and sitting in a room and talking to someone about how you feel straight across from them, and feels intimidated by that, more and more there's therapy opening up where it's a walk and talk situation where you're alongside them. You're not having to have that sort of intense, almost face-off experience, and that can be really helpful. So yeah.
That they sound like amazing projects. And what were the two different websites for the project and the charity? What were they?
Yeah, so it's thehearthdevon.com. That's hearth as in the old hearth and home, sort of center of warmth and nourishment. And right to freedom.org.uk. And my conventional counselling website is freddieweaver.co.uk, and that's Freddie with a Y. So you can catch me on there.
Amazing. Thank you for coming on. That was, I felt like I learned a lot, and an incredible conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for asking me.